Have you ever seen a professional player buy an item that looks very strange? Item you don't usually see in a standard build. However, it is one of the main reasons for his victory in the match. The strange thing is that professionals don't build in the same way in every game. Sometimes they add anti-heal, and sometimes they buy defense, even though they are playing damage champions. And sometimes they change a large part of the build as the game progresses.
The question here is not, what is the strongest build? The real question is, how does the professional know what they need at this very moment? In this video, we won't say ready builds, but we will see how purchasing decisions change from the beginning of the match to the end. And why do professionals choose some items over others? Because the real difference is not between a player who knows a ready build, but between a player who copies what he is used to and a player who understands what the match needs in front of him. Okay, if professionals do not follow a stable build, so how do they decide what to buy? Before we answer this question, we need to understand a very simple idea. Items are not just about increasing damage or defense. Each item in the game tries to solve a specific problem. Sometimes you need a bigger damage. Sometimes you need a way to deal with the healing. And sometimes you just need to stay alive for a few extra seconds in the fight. And that's why you might see the same hero build completely differently from one match to another. And the best way to understand this idea, it's not about memorizing the names of the items, but to see how the players think when they choose it. So, let's move on to a real professional match, and we try to anticipate the problems that each team will face before we see any item being purchased. Let's use this match as an example. On one side, we have OG, and on the other, Visaka. But before we look at a single item purchase, let's try reading both team compositions together. If we look at OG's lineup, we immediately notice Dharma on the front line, alongside Lian Po, who has excellent tools for engaging fights and creating opportunities for his team in teamfights. Meanwhile, Fade and Mai have the ability to quickly reach the enemy backline and punish vulnerable targets. And with Lady Sun serving as the team's primary damage dealer in the later stages of the game, the team's identity starts to become very clear. OG wants to be the team that starts the fight. Lian Po initiates the engagement. Then Fade and Mai dive onto the enemy backline, while Lady Sun is given enough space to deal as much damage as possible. In other words, this composition relies on coordinated, fast engagements and eliminating key targets before the enemy has a chance to respond. But if we look at the Visaka team, we notice a slightly different picture. We have a strong frontline composed of Flowborn and Byron, and they are capable of absorbing a large amount of damage and staying in the fight for a long time. And behind them comes Yuhan, which provides healing and sustainability for the rest of the team members. And with Lady Zhen becoming very dangerous in long team fights, in addition to Marco Polo, who is capable of continuing to cause harm over time, the team's identity is starting to become clearer. The Visaka team does not rely on quick entry and finishing the fight within seconds, but it relies on staying in the fight for as long as possible, where Flowborn and Byron take on the task of holding the front line, while Yuhan maintains the continuity of the team. Both Lady Zhen and Marco Polo take advantage of the long duration of the fight to inflict as much damage as possible. Now that we understand the nature of this matchup, let's see whether those ideas actually started to appear in the first item choices. Because professional players don't wait until the middle of the game to adapt. Their decisions begin from the very first minute, and the best place to start is the jungle. Because both teams chose junglers with completely different playstyles. On OG's side, we have Fade, an assassin whose goal is to reach the enemy backline and quickly eliminate key targets. That's why he started with Rapacious Bite, Boots of Dexterity, and early offensive components. All of these choices support the same idea: faster farming, greater mobility, and earlier damage output. On the other side, we have a Flowborn tank who started with Giant's Grip and Boots of Fortitude. And here we see the exact opposite approach. He's not trying to burst down targets as quickly as possible. Instead, he wants to become an additional frontline for his team, absorb damage, and create space for his teammates to engage in fights. From the very first minute, we can already see both teams building around the identity of their compositions. But did OG stay committed to its game plan? If we look at the rest of OG's players, the answer is yes. Lady Sun began investing early into damage and critical strike items. Meanwhile, Mai focused on magical power and cooldown reduction, and this perfectly matches what we expected from the draft. OG doesn't want extended fights. They want to reach their priority targets quickly and punish them with as much damage as possible. Even the roamers started revealing the team's plan. The same pattern appeared in the support role. Lian Po started with Guardian, while Yuhan chose Crimson Shadow. And it's important to remember that these aren't just random items. They're the first step toward the type of support each player intends to provide later in the game. Lian Po wants to help his team initiate fights
and create space, while Yuhuan wants to maximize sustain and provide continuous support for her teammates. If you've noticed, we still haven't seen any counterbuilding, and we haven't seen any major adjustments to item paths, because at this stage, players are still executing the original game plan they entered the match with. But what's interesting is that every player started from a completely different angle, not because one build is stronger than the other, but because each player is trying to fulfill a different role within the match. The real question is, what happens once the teamfights begin? And what happens when the problems we predicted during the draft start appearing in actual gameplay? That's where the stage begins in which decision-making becomes more important than simply following the original plan. In the early game, every player was building according to their hero's role and the game plan they entered the match with. But once we reached the mid-game, the match itself started asking new questions. Is my damage enough? Can I survive inside teamfights? Is there a particular enemy causing problems for my team? And this is where real decision-making begins. If you remember our draft analysis, we predicted that Yuhuan could become a major problem as the game progressed. And as we entered the mid-game, we started to see the first real response from OG's players. One of the things that stood out to me the most was that Fade and Mai were both trying to solve almost the same problem, but each did it in a completely different way. Fade completed his build with Axe of Torment, Blazing Cape, Doomsday, and Boots of Resistance. At this point, some people might ask, why would an assassin like Fade buy a defensive item such as Blazing Cape? The answer is simple. He's no longer fighting only fragile targets. He's now facing a team with a strong frontline, healing, and sustained durability. So his goal is no longer just diving in and killing a single target. His goal is to remain impactful throughout the fight for as long as possible. And on top of that, Blazing Cape provided another very important benefit, reducing the enemy team's healing. And Mai approached the same problem differently. Instead of buying a defensive item, she purchased Venomous Staff, because as a mage, she deals damage from a safer distance. She doesn't need to survive in the same way Fade does. She simply needs a way to reduce the value of the healing Yuhuan provides to her team. And this brings us to one of the most important lessons from this match. Professional players don't ask, what is the best item? They ask, what problem am I trying to solve? Then they choose the tool that fits their role. Meanwhile, some players didn't need to change their plan at all, and not everyone was forced to adjust their build to the same degree. Lady Sun is a perfect example. At this stage, she continued building Eternity Blade, Master Sword, and components toward Daybreaker, because her role had not changed. She was still OG's primary DPS source. For her, the best decision was simply to continue executing the original plan as efficiently as possible. And that's an important lesson. Adapting doesn't always mean changing your build. Sometimes adapting means understanding when you don't need to change it.
While OG was trying to deal with sustain,
the Saha was trying to deal with something else. The fast engagements from Fade and Mai. Lady Zhen began building Splendor. At first glance, this might seem like a strange decision. Why not build more damage? Because damage wasn't the problem. Survival was. With Fade and Mai constantly threatening the backline, a single positioning mistake could result in an instant death. That's why survivability tools became more valuable than additional damage. We saw something similar with Marco Polo. Instead of focusing entirely on offense, he started adding items that gave him greater safety in fights, because a marksman who stays alive and keeps dealing damage is far stronger than a marksman with higher damage who dies first. If the early game tells us the plan, then the mid-game reveals the problems that appear while trying to execute it. And at this point, we could clearly see that players were no longer building only around their heroes. They were building around what was actually happening in the match. OG started looking for answers to healing and sustain, while the Sucker started looking for answers to burst damage and fast engages, and that proves something extremely important. Professional players do not follow a fixed build. They constantly adjust their decisions based on what the match demands. But despite all these adjustments, the game was still at a stage where mistakes could be recovered from. The late game, however, is a completely different story, because at this stage, a single mistake can be enough to lose the entire match. In the early game, the focus was on building power. In the mid-game, players started buying solutions to the problems that appeared during the match. But now, the game has reached a completely different phase. A phase where any teamfight can decide the outcome, and where death is more expensive than ever before. As a result, players' priorities begin to change. If you remember the mid-game, we saw Fade and Mai trying to deal with Vezikar's healing and sustain. But as we moved into the late game, we noticed something important. Earlier in the match, Fade was using Blazing Cape because it provided both durability and anti-healing. But as the game progressed, his need for damage and burst potential became increasingly important, especially when every fight was starting to look like it could be the final fight of the game. That's when we began to see him gradually shift toward more offensive options. And this teaches us an important lesson. The item you need at minute 10 may not be the item you need at minute 20. Mai, on the other hand, gave us a completely different example. We saw Venomous Staff remain in her build even during the later stages of the game. And the reason is simple. The problem she bought it to solve still existed. Yuhuan was still providing healing and sustain to her team, so there was no reason to replace it. This leads us to an excellent rule. Don't sell an item because there's a stronger one available. Replace it only when the problem it solves no longer exists. One of the best examples of this was Lady Sun. From the beginning of the match until the very end, her role never changed. She remained OG's primary DPS source. That's why she continued investing in critical strike, attack speed, and damage. But the real change appeared in her final item slots, because she was no longer looking only for more damage. She was looking for a way to stay alive when the decisive fight finally arrived. And this is where the difference between mid-game thinking and late-game thinking becomes clear. On the other side, Vezakar's players were thinking in a very similar way. If OG was asking how to eliminate targets as quickly as possible, Vezakar was asking a different question: how do we stay alive long enough to win the fight? At this stage, we saw greater reliance on tools such as Splendor, Destiny, and even though Lady Zen is a mage, she didn't invest everything into maximizing damage. The challenge was staying alive when Fade or Mai reached the backline. Marco Polo provided one of the best late-game examples in the entire match. Earlier in the game, he was adding tools that helped him survive, but now we started seeing items like Sage's Sanctuary appear. And that reflects a very important idea. At the beginning of the match, a small increase in damage can give you a noticeable advantage. But in the late game, a second chance at life may be worth more than any additional offensive stats. As for Lian Po, his roaming item was fully upgraded, and at that point, it became clear that a roamer's value doesn't come from the damage they deal. It comes from the vision, control, protection, and utility they provide during decisive teamfights. If the early game tells us the plan, and the mid-game tells us about the problems that appeared while executing that plan, then the late game reveals what matters most in the entire match: staying alive. That's why most of the decisions players made during this phase weren't focused solely on increasing damage. They were focused on survival, creating a second chance, and remaining effective in the fight for as long as possible. Because the game had reached a point where deaths were more costly, mistakes were harder to recover from, and a single teamfight could decide everything. And that brings us to the most important lesson from this entire match. Professional players don't build for numbers. They build to solve the most important problem at that specific moment in the game. And after everything we've seen in this match, I believe the most important lesson we can take away is professionals don't buy items because they are already included in a ready-made build. They buy it because it solves a problem within the game. Sometimes you need anti-heal, and sometimes you need defense, and sometimes you need to sacrifice a part of the damage to stay alive. So next time you open the store, don't ask, what is the strongest build? Ask, what do I need right now? Because this is the real difference between saving the build and understanding the game. And if you like this type of analysis, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.